SVC Media.
Welcome to iGaming Daily, analysing the news from the betting and gaming industry all over the globe. Supported by SBC Summit Latino America, bringing together the leadership teams and product specialists from retail and online operators in Latin American markets.
Discover the potential of Latin America's booming iGaming and sports betting markets at SBC Summit Latin America, the premier industry event in the region. Join SBC at the Seminole Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Miami from October 31st to November the 2nd. Register now at sbcevents.com.
It's another milestone moment for the Gambling Act Review White Paper as the Department for Culture, Media and Sport consultation on implementation of the Research, Education and Treatment Levy has begun. Projecting that 100 million will be directed towards the NHS via the initiative, the RET levy, one of the key recommendations of the white paper, will be commissioned by the NHS with all mandatory operator contributions directed towards research, prevention and treatment of gambling harm. As with numerous other white paper proposals, the RET levy will be subject to an extensive consultation where we can expect to see charities such as GambleAware and GamCare, operators and trade bodies voice their views on this matter. And this will be the core of our topic on Tuesday's episode of iGaming Daily, sponsored by SBC Summit Latino America, with Ted Orme-Claye returning from his stud performance in yesterday's episode and Conor Porter joining. How are you both doing? Conor, we'll start with you because I think our listeners have actually heard too much of Ted's voice in the last 24 hours.
Oh, wow. What a statement that is to kick off the podcast. Wow. Yeah, I'm doing all right. I'm doing good. Glad to be back on the podcast, but it's a shame that the October weather that we had last time has completely disappeared, and now we have normal October weather of just dreary winds and rain and grey clouds everywhere here in the UK.
I am rocking the most stylish When Harry Met Sally turtleneck you'll ever see. It was that cold this morning. But I'm actually really happy we've got turtleneck weather back. It's appropriate to wear it now without sweating so much. And as vivid as that imagery is for the viewers at the start of this podcast, Ted, chirp us up a little bit, make it a bit more brighter. Go on.
Yeah, good to be back for the second time in a row, James. Thank you. It's nice to see your comments is what I get for my loyalty. But I've got to say the jumper is good, mate. The jumper is very nice.
Yeah.
Turtleneck, I should say.
Thank you, turtleneck. Yeah, it's a bit... No, I won't say that. Let's move on, shall we? It's a bit breezy, so it's a bit too tight, but we'll get there one day. But let's get back to the NHS and this RET levy. Ted, we'll start with you on this. Like, can you just give us a breakdown of the background to this development? Because it's not the first, obviously, we've talked about RET levy before. I mean, we've done something with Gordon Moody in the past where there's like a little mini documentary where we wanted to kind of get their thoughts on the levy, the charities. Can you just give us some background to what the issue actually is and what the consultations could mean?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, James. This is something that's been really extensively discussed throughout the course of this Gambling Act review. It's become one of the sort of biggest talking points, biggest topics of it. Essentially, so a bit of a basic background. In the UK, all the operators do voluntary donations currently towards GambleAware, who currently serve as the sort of primary commissioner of what's done with these funds, deciding where money goes to with regards to funding various research, education, and treatment organisations. The biggest operators, obviously, are the biggest donors. Your Bet365s, your Entains, your Flutters, and so on. The current system has been criticised by quite a few people. GambleAware themselves have been critical of it to an extent. They've been one of the biggest voices calling for a mandatory levy, because they've noted that there's a lot of discrepancies between certain operators in terms of how much they donate. So they've been calling for this mandatory levy to be implemented, where operators will be required to make a yearly contribution out of their gross gambling yield. But there have been other stakeholders and reform advocates calling for an even bigger change, and that is for the NHS to take over primary responsibility for commissioning this funding, which is now what the government have proposed today out of out of the out of their white paper, which was published in April, which they're now going to be consulting on.
What was so there was an issue with the NHS where they refused the funding originally, didn't they? Am I right in saying that? Or they didn't want it? They didn't want funding from problem gambling.
Yeah, and so from what I remember, they cut ties with GambleAware, didn't they, and some of the other sort of industry organisations because some figures in the NHS have been critical of GambleAware, accusing it of being too dependent on the industry because of the whole the operator donation model. And and that's been quite a big motivating factor for them to want to have this system where operators just give the money over to the NHS, to this public body, which then decides what to do with it, as opposed to an organisation which they perceive as being connected to the industry.
Mm-hmm. And Conor, why do you think this is so significant for gambling reform?
Mainly for the distribution of funds to help support those that are struggling with gambling harm or gambling addiction, problem gambling across the UK, making sure that, the funding can be spread out across England, Wales and Scotland to help those that need it most, and to also to make sure that everyone who is conducting gambling business in the UK is providing funding to support and help those that are struggling with gambling addiction or gambling harm or problem gambling in the UK, so that they can get better and better quality of life and so on from that.
Mm-hmm. And Ted, kind of how has the prospect of an RET levy been received by the industry and charity sectors, both before and after the DCMS announcement? Because like you said, we said it earlier in the show, we've done stuff with Gordon Moody before in the past where they didn't know how much would be beneficial for a charity in terms of the levy requirements. Can you just give us an idea of before and after this announcement of what it was perceived?
So I'll take this a bit of in a strange narrative, I think, by starting with the after, since that's going to be the quickest one to address to start with. Because obviously at the moment we've not had any responses from a lot of the charities yet. The main sort of response we've had is from the Betting and Gaming Council, which represents the regulated British betting and gaming industry, as its name suggests. The main point they made about it, which I thought was quite interesting, was that they think the National Lottery should be included in the list of organisations that are going to be required to contribute, as not just bookmakers and casino operators. Because they made a point which I think was quite interesting, that obviously people can still become addicted to instant lottery games and scratch cards and things like that. Obviously the charity sector, we've not had anything yet, but as you said, we've spoken with quite a few guys from that sector over the past year or two. And as you said, some of them, I think, obviously the trouble is no one's got a crystal ball, no one can predict the future. So a lot of them said, well, can we say whether this will be positive or negative? We can't really tell until it happens. One thing that I did hear quite a lot, though, that was often a bit of a cause for concern, was that the UK these UK charities have done a very good job of setting up a very extensive independent network of charitable organisations and support and treatment networks that, yes, does obviously get a lot of these donations from the industry, but isn't, it's not like they're receiving orders from the industry and stuff like this. And I think some people are just concerned that they want to make sure that when this RET levy is implemented, it doesn't damage that existing treatment network and potentially undo any of the quite hard work that a lot of these guys have put in over the years.
And I want to fire this question to both of you, and Conor, will go to you first. Do either of you see any issues with the DCMS's plans for the levy and kind of how it will function?
I think some within the industry, as Ted said, already mentioned about how they believe the National Lottery should be contributing towards the levy itself because of how easily accessible. We talk about how, these days with mobile gaming, you can have a casino in your pocket. So, well, these days you can have scratch cards in your pocket because of instant scratch cards available on the National Lottery. So question whether or not the National Lottery should be providing a percentage of the gross gambling yield. But in terms of other issues, it would be whether or not the right amount of funding is getting distributed out to the correct areas of the country in order to address potential higher levels of gambling harm or problem gambling or gambling addiction in different areas of the country, in England, Scotland and Wales. Whether services get enough funding for their services to keep going throughout the year. So there are issues which hopefully over these next 8 weeks, when the government has their consultation period for the levy, hopefully they get raised up and addressed and ironed out, essentially, to create something that can be serviceable for those that need it most, which are the people that are suffering. So making sure that that's at the forefront of the mind of anyone with a stakeholder in the gambling industry when it comes to these consultations moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Ted?
Yeah, I think that was a really good point by Conor there, actually. This is obviously, it's a huge undertaking of completely reforming the way the current funding model for RET works. And then, making sure it's applied proportionately across the UK and addressing areas that need it the most, particularly regionally. Obviously, there was quite an interesting part of it regarding that. The DCMS have laid out plans to set up various treatment centres and facilities in quite from what I remember, quite a geographically diverse range of areas. So they've clearly got the plan to do that, but obviously putting this into effect will take a lot of work. I think obviously we can all agree that I think it's certainly positive that operators of all shapes and sizes should be now required to do this. I don't think that's a particularly negative thing. I don't think we've talked about this yet, but the percentage wise, I think it's 1% of gross gambling yield for online operators and 0.4% for just wholly retail ones and casinos. I think, this is obviously positive because it just means that, like I said, all operators, no matter of the size, will be required to help fund these programs. And in the long run, it could also just help the more general public perception of the industry, maybe paint it in a bit more of a positive light, because it shows that money has been made, but then it has been redirected to help support people who may be suffering from gambling harm. I think that's kind of my summary of that.
No, it's a good summary. It's a good summary. And, we've mentioned a few, let's say, entities who will express a certain viewpoint. You've mentioned stakeholders will have one as well. You mentioned stakeholders anyway. But with a consultation on the levy set to commence, and Conor's mentioned it'd be an 8-week process.
Yeah, 8-week process. So we're looking at the moment, if it's starting from today, we're looking December 12th would be the end date of that point. Mm-hmm. So I would say roughly maybe, I don't know when they would release responses or any sort of feedback from those consultations from that end date.
But once we do get that consultation at the end date, what viewpoints do you think will be expressed throughout this 8-week period? We'll start with you, Ted.
So I'll start with the bookmakers and the operators themselves. I mean, I think, as I said, the Betting and Gaming Council, which represents a great deal of these companies, has already said that it welcomes the reform. I think a lot of them have been very accepting of that. They think that a lot of them seem to think, it's the right way forward. It's it had already been pretty much touted way before the white paper began, before it got published, that this would be an outcome of the paper. So I think all operators are now very accepting and welcoming of it. Obviously, the one area they might be calling for within the consultation to be for the National Lottery to be included, as I've already said. The charity sector is where it's going to get interesting because, as I said before, there might be a lot of people in that sector, the existing one that's been built up over many years, who might be concerned about what this sudden change will have for them and their funding. Changing it from GambleAware handling this to the NHS is a very big shift. And problem gambling is not something that the NHS has as much experience in some cases than a lot of these charities do. So there might be obviously I can't speak for these charities myself. I don't work for any, I've never worked in that sector, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if there's a little bit of pushback to an extent regarding that, and the NHS taking this very authoritative role over it.
Yeah, I think you raise a really decent concern there regarding the NHS, because we know, depending on your political view maybe, but I mean, it's not, best way to describe this, it's not unfair to say that the NHS has been underfunded for years, and it does raise questions on not just the knowledge compared to like GambleAware, who would be probably better to handle this in terms of their experience, but do they have the people power for this? Are they funded enough to handle this research and this levy going forward, do you think?
It's a very good point to raise. As you said, the NHS has been, like a lot of areas of UK society, quite heavily impacted by austerity measures over the years, starting from, if you want to go way far back, from the recession back in 2007. It's been having a lot of problems with funding itself. And then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic put a huge amount of stress on the institution. We all know just how much the various NHS staff had to work throughout that to keep keep hospitals running with the huge amount of stress they were under. And when we see a lot of reports in the media quite regularly, don't we, about continuing problems with waiting lists and so on, and a lot of the difficulties it's facing. I think obviously the counter argument to that is the NHS will be then the one that's handling this funding and getting it directly from the government, from the RET levy. So I guess the argument is, they can fund the expansion of its gambling remit using the RET levy, perhaps. But it's definitely something that I think will be raised in consultations, actually, about how well can the NHS perform this task.
Mm-hmm.
Say another viewpoint that might be expressed, and what was raised in the BGC's reaction to the levy today, was the percentage of gross gambling yield potentially being on a sliding scale for smaller operators, especially in the land-based sector. 0.4 might sound small, but for land-based operators that are still trying to recover from the pandemic, it might be too much for them. So that will be raised for sure by a lot of stakeholders during this consultation period as a potential point that needs to be reviewed and analysed to make sure that the support is still being provided for those that need it, but also that we're not creating a situation where operators could potentially shut down, or people could lose their jobs because of. I'm not sure if it will get to that, because I don't have any statistical data to back that up, but it was just a point raised by the BGC. So they obviously have closer relations with operators than what we do. So
it's a fantastic point, and I don't know how many times in any walk of life we have to say a one-size-fits-all approach never really works out well, because every single operator or company or whatsoever, they all have their own specific issues or concerns you have to go through. So that'll be interesting to see what comes up with that. But let's look now towards the next year. And when all's said and done, December, we're saying, is the end of the 8-week period. How likely do you think after the deadline would we see the levy come into effect within, let's say, 12 months after the deadline? Let's give them some grace period.
Well, yeah, you mentioned the deadline, December 12th, and in the actual statement that the government put out earlier today about the levy, they said at the bottom that the UK government and the UKGC are expecting to try and implement key elements of the white paper by summer next year. And it could be optimistic, but obviously the levy is quite a significant part of it, not only because of the impact that it will have, but also the impact that it will have on operators, but also how vital it is for those that need it the most, in terms of those that are suffering from gambling harm. So it could be one of those that's accelerated in terms of work that's done by the UK government and by the Gambling Commission. And maybe pushed in terms of further consultations to make sure that it can be addressed quickly and correctly at the same time, to make sure that those that need it are getting the services and the treatment that they need the most.
Yeah, I said it's optimistic. I still think there's precedence to say the summer's too soon. I understand the point of getting it out quickly because it's an important matter. There's people who suffer from problem gambling who need to kind of receive a lot of benefits from this new levy once it's been decided what it'll be and confirmed. But I think if it takes a little bit longer, let's get it right instead of let's getting it out. Like, let's actually think about what we're doing. Let's perfect it before we release it instead of backtracking and trying to fix a mistake post-release just to get it done with. Ted, round us off. Finish the podcast with your thoughts.
I mean, yeah. So you've said, I think I agree with you, James. The summer 2024 is a very ambitious target for them. I think, just based on precedent, if we look at how many times the white paper itself was delayed, I think for me personally, I've started taking a lot of the government's targets on this with a very hefty pinch of salt, let's say. And not only that, but also I think a big factor we need to consider, and I know I've mentioned this on other podcasts, but there's the potential for a general election. Yeah. And so the latest they can have it is obviously January 2025, which would give them plenty of time to get it in force for 2024. But, the government are currently down in the polls, but now inflation started to ease again. So, there's potential. They can call it whenever they want, and a lot of commentators have been suggesting that next year could be the year for an election, aren't they?
Do you think they're rushing this through? The Conservative government are rushing this through to help them when it comes to a general election in the summer?
Maybe. It'd certainly be quite a good PR point for them, is to say, yeah, we got gambling reform over the line.
Because they have been quite quick since they announced the consultation.
Yeah,
the white paper proposal consultation.
They have been moving quickly. Yeah,
there's been quite a few developments in the last few months alone. But I think that kind of leads to positives for a general election next year.
Yeah.
Kind of, these are the staples. These are what we've done in the last 12 months.
It just also depends on other political factors. Other developments could happen between now and then that make them think, right, we want to call a general election now. Let's say they were to do it in, May or something like that, and they've not quite got it all over the line. Suddenly, the getting gambling reform done becomes less of a priority because now you've got to focus on winning your election. And then there's also the other fact of, if Labour were to take power, all the parties seem to be very much in agreement on gambling reform, to be fair, but they might just have other priorities of what to do first. We've seen a lot of their talking points from the last conference was, very heavily on housing, for example, wasn't it? So, they might get in power and think, we still want to do this, but it's not our first port of call. So the election is just always that big,
elephant in the room.
Yeah, again, to use a term I used yesterday, again, elephant in the room that could completely change the course of where this goes.
Mm-hmm. I did say Ted could sign off, but Conor, do you want anything to add? Or?
Nothing to add, but just to reiterate that this is a vital service for those that need it the most, and hopefully that is emphasised enough during these consultation periods when it comes to recommendations from stakeholders within the industry.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a nice way to sign off the podcast. Conor, Ted, thank you for joining us. To the listeners out there, as always, any additional articles from Ted Orme-Claye and Conor Porter that will be on the SBC News site and Casino Beat site respectively, I'll put the links in the description below. Check out more. They've done some great write-ups and some great detail that we've not even touched into. So make sure you click on the link below. But apart from that, I will see you tomorrow for Wednesday's podcast. But until then, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of iGaming Daily, brought to you in conjunction with SBC Summit Latino America, being held at the Seminole Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Miami on the 31st of October to the 2nd of November. If you want to find out more about some of the subjects raised today, feel free to explore any of the sites in the SBC News Network. Happy reading.